So I thought I'd just go for something uncontroversial this time. I'd like to discuss Muslim immigration because it seems to be a kind of background issue that's rumbling on in society just now. Let's to be clear, when I discuss immigration, I'm not discussing immigration numbers. I'm discussing the social and cultural effects of Muslim immigration. So a bit of background. So obviously, particularly in the right-wing media or on the internet in general, there is a general hubbub about Muslim immigration and complaining about it and considering it to be problematic. Now, whether or not this is true, I think the impression definitely exists, even if it might be wrong, but people definitely believe it, so it's worth discussing. There's also the issue that there's a perception that authorities are just too woke to care or to take any action about any issues that do exist. Again, this may or may not be actually true, but I think it's worth having a look at. So let's just decide whether or not these impressions have anything behind them. I think, to be honest, if you look at the reputation of Muslim communities, there definitely is something there. There's a general perception that Muslims just don't integrate; they stay separate. They're not like Poles or Indians or Chinese who just seem to slot in and nobody notices. The Muslims always seem to stand out. It's very distinct. And then there's issues that come with those communities, particularly where there are large communities of cousin marriage, interbreeding, and the problems that come from consanguineous relationships. Then, of course, the grooming gangs are very heavily associated with Pakistani men in general, but also other Muslim men. There's been attempts in certain areas where a kind of territorialism seems to appear, where people claim that somewhere is a Muslim area, and that's not compatible with the British way of thinking. There's no legal definition of a Hindu area or a Muslim area or a British area or a Christian area. I mean, to some extent, these places do kind of exist vaguely, but there's no legal definition or right to claim it. Then there's things like overt public praying, a kind of in-your-face religious practice. Harassment of Christian preachers. Now, you would think in a Christian country, a Christian preacher could preach. It seems to be a problem. And there's much more serious things like honour killings, the treatment of women, women kept at home with no English, very isolated, and things like forced and child marriages. There's also a vague sense or belief that Muslims are more likely to be sex offenders, which is probably true according to statistics in some ways, but not in others. And this is not just the UK. Various European countries have now very much tightened their immigration rules, particularly for Muslims, due to problems with immigration, largely from Muslim communities. And this doesn't seem to happen with other religions and ethnicities. It doesn't happen with Chinese, Sikhs, Hindus, Buddhists. There's 2.5, Chinese obviously aren't a religion, but there's 2.5 million people from these groups, and we never seem to hear any problems from these communities. And now there are about 3.6 million Muslims in the UK, so because there are more of them, you would naturally expect to see somewhat more problems, but it seems to be entirely disproportionate. It should be worth noting, however, that half the immigrants are second and third generation. But Islam is a broad concept. There's many different Islamic states, which are quite different from each other, and many different schools or traditions in Islam. So, for instance, you've got the Sunni Islam, but that has multiple subgroups under it. Shia Islam has, again, multiple subgroups under it, different legal traditions, different cultures. And then, of course, there's non-denominational Muslims as well. So look around some of these Muslim countries. These countries here, Pakistan, Afghanistan, Sudan, Saudi Arabia, the Kurds aren't actually a nation, but they are an ethnic group. And they have a reputation for being involved in honour killings. But these are the kind of countries where we tend to find people in the news being problematic from. But on the other hand, there's countries like Turkey, Azerbaijan, Indonesia. These are all Muslim majority countries. And you don't really hear about people from these countries being problems. In fact, Azerbaijan and Indonesia actually have laws against cousin marriage, despite being Muslim countries. Turkey doesn't have laws against it, but it's very rare culturally. So there are big differences between different Muslim countries that we should remain aware of. And what is the big difference? What is making some countries problematic and others not? Well, I'm going to claim that the key factor actually is the level of tribalism. There's a great deal of tribalism in some of these Muslim countries, more than we expect. If you look at this map here, this shows Afghanistan and Pakistan and the tribal regions. And this is a simplified version, I think. These areas actually have subgroups within them. And these areas have always had a tribal culture. Likewise, if you look at Somalia here, it's got a huge range of tribal areas within it. Look at this table here. This is an academic piece of academic work where somebody has tried to measure the tribalism of various countries around the world. And different academics have done this in different ways and got somewhat different results. But generally, places like Pakistan and Afghanistan are right at the top, and the other Muslim countries, East African countries, Middle Eastern countries, are right up there, not far behind. Places like Africa actually have decreasing levels of tribalism in them, despite the fact we might have seen Tarzan films as kids and think of Africa as a place of tribes. Actually, tribalism is dying off in large parts of Africa. It seems to be the Muslim world that's retaining tribalism on the planet. Now, I'm going to give you an explanation for why this is, or what I believe it is. And before I do that, I need to tell you a little bit about the source for this explanation, because it is relevant. It comes from a guy called Raymond Ibrahim, and he is a Arabic-speaking scholar. He's a published author. He was a specialist in the Library of Congress on Middle Eastern or Islamic issues. He's a fellow of various institutes. He's a published author and a scholar and an academic, but he does have a distinct anti-Islamic bias, which is important you know that. Now, when I say bias, I don't mean prejudice. Okay, the guy seems to have argued his cases very well. He's allowed to have a bias. Everybody in a debate has a bias. A prejudice is when you don't care what anybody else says. It's prejudice before judgment. You're not going to listen to any other arguments, whereas I think Raymond Ibrahim makes strong arguments, but you need to be aware of his bias, I think, before I tell you this. If you want to go and look at the video yourself where I got this from, it's here. You can pause this video and take this down and go and have a look yourself if you want. But moving on to the actual explanation. So in a nutshell, simplified, there's various kinds of Islam or aspects to Islam. The first one is what you might expect, the devout Islam. It's all about fasting, praying, and charity. And this is very much like any other religion. It's about being the good guy, helping others, etc. And that is not a problematic part of Islam. The other side of Islam, however, which seems to be there for historic reasons, is what you call jihad. It's being faithful by waging war on the unbelievers. Now, when Muhammad was preaching Islam, this worked pretty well for the wandering desert tribes who were already effectively waging war, guerrilla war on their neighbors. So they would just go away and say, well, yes, we are good Muslims because we are fighting and raiding and stealing their women. These guys weren't really good Muslims. They used to drink wine and rape all the slave girls. But this was allowed in Islam. And I think probably because the reality needed it. It was the only way to get the religion to spread amongst these people. So you have this kind of religion which allows tribalism. Most religions suppress tribalism. Islam has a kind of carve out for it, and I think that has allowed tribalism to perpetuate longer in Muslim countries than in other countries. I've given a very simple overview here, so you'd have to go and look at the presentation yourself from Raymond Ibrahim to get the details. But looking at the history of Middle Eastern countries, you've had the Ottoman Empire, which covered most of the Eastern Mediterranean kind of area. And the Ottoman Empire was based around Turkey, Constantinople, which was effectively a kind of city-state. But Turkey functioned more or less as a nation-state at that time, based around Constantinople. But the regions around it that they conquered, they treated as provinces, and they left the tribes to run themselves. They didn't turn them into other countries. I don't see them as other countries. They were just tribal regions. And then there's the British Empire. Isn't it nice how those maps match? The British Empire obviously was largely centered around India. It eventually took over part of the Ottoman Empire as well, and around Egypt, etc. But the northwestern part, the northwest frontier, was heavily Islamic, and it was very mountainous, and it was a pretty rough gig for the British, to be honest. They had quite a hard time. But again, they ended up more or less just letting the tribes rule themselves. Again, they kind of treated it as provinces. When the British Empire retracted, the British did try to create nation states. They actually created Saudi Arabia, for instance. They created Jordan, although that was under the Palestinian Mandate. But the British did try to leave nation states behind, and you might be surprised to discover that the actual reason they did that was because it stops the slave trade. It's much easier to go raiding in this loosely affiliated tribal areas than it is in a nation state, because they've got an army and they might turn up and meet you, which could be unpleasant. So the British did try and leave nation states behind, but to the people in them, they were just lines on the map. They didn't. The people there just, they've been dealing with foreign powers, with the Russians, with Alexander the Great, with everybody for millennia, and the British were just another lot of external powers. Now, these tribal behaviours are not entirely unique, obviously. They're a human thing. They're not a particularly Muslim or Islamic thing. The West still has, for instance, traveller communities can be quite tribal in relation to the settled community around them. Then there's been in the UK, there's been certain areas with kind of very tribal Catholic Protestant conflicts. And political parties can be very, very tribal as well. We're not free of tribal behaviours here. But generally, we tend to use sports to attempt to earth or distract those instincts. And people get very tribal about their sports teams. But that's okay. We just keep it in a little box of wearing sports, and it doesn't give us any trouble. Now, in the tribal worldview, these nation states are just lines drawn on a map by somebody else. The places like the Hindu Kush, Afghanistan, Pakistan, they've had Alexander the Great, they've had the Roman Empire, they've had the Russians, they've had the British. They're just powers that come through, and these guys see themselves in their tribal lands, and they just deal with whatever power is coming from the outside at the time. Inside their world, not a lot changes. So the borders of these countries just don't mean very much to them, and they don't have maybe a strong nationalist affinity to their own governments. They have affinities to their tribes. In fact, in many cases, like Pakistan and Afghanistan, the tribes are fighting low-level wars with each other and with the government. It's not unusual. And these people, they're usually poor in these tribes. Now, it's maybe not be true of the oil states, but that's got a very specific reason. But generally speaking, tribal peoples are poor because they don't have democracy. In fact, the Middle Eastern states really, if you wonder why Middle Eastern states don't want to take refugees, it's because they have enough trouble maintaining tribal relationships inside their own countries without people from other tribes moving in to their national territory. So this is an academic paper, The Social, Political and Economic Ills of Tribalism, a Study on Impact. That's the name of the paper. You can look it up if you want to. But they gave this very good quote. Tribalism, or the strong affiliation and loyalty to one's tribe or ethnic group, has influenced society throughout history. Tribal relationships can foster a sense of community and belonging, yet tribalism has far-reaching negative impacts, particularly in the political, social and economic domains. Tribalism can lead to exclusion, inequality, and the division in many cultures, creating an environment that is favourable to bias, corruption, and instability. In other words, tribalism just generally makes you poor, except for exceptional circumstances. So how do tribal people think? Well, at the core, their loyalty is to their tribe. It's an us and them mentality. This generally leads to a failure to integrate. It doesn't mean people are necessarily unpleasant. Some tribes are famous for their hospitality to foreigners, but essentially their core loyalty lies with their tribe. And this can lead to a kind of failure to condemn criminality of members of their tribe. They feel they have a duty to support people from their own tribe against the outside, no matter what they may have done. And then lying to outsiders can also be considered acceptable if it's in your tribe's interest. And obviously, tribes want to defend their territory, which gives a kind of let's create our own territory here. It's an Islamizing space kind of mentality. Then, of course, within tribes and with relationships with external tribes, status is extremely important. People in nation states have inalienable rights. In tribal mentalities, your rights depend on your status. So this, when people feel that their status is threatened, then this can lead to things like wars or honor killings and things like that, which is not the way things normally work in a nation state. Also means that when you have a tribal or clan system, internal loyalty and retention of assets like land can be very important, which can lead to kind of things like cousin and child marriage, where people want to keep things in the family. And because often in conflicts, especially status-driven conflicts, the women can often be the target. The best way to insult your enemy is to rape or abduct his women. Then that can lead these tribes to be very protective of their women, which they would see as protection. And from the environment they're in, it might make a lot of sense. But it seems to be a kind of repression when put in a Western context. And then, of course, it means that if women are not from your tribe, then they're kind of fair game. That can lead to, they seem to be a natural target if you have some kind of beef with the host nation. No, it doesn't take much thinking to realize that this is actually a recipe for disaster. Now, I personally believe that all people everywhere have the same mix of personalities. I don't think any particular people have different personalities anywhere in the world. You've got, this is a distribution here, roughly I'm saying, it shows you've got your average people, you've got the nice people, you've got the nasty people, everywhere you go. In fact, every population is believed to have 7% of it has some kind of dark triad personality type. That is, they are manipulative, they are self-absorbed, and they don't give a damn about anybody else. 7% of every population has these attributes to a degree that are harmful to people around them. And that's a problem that everybody's got everywhere. So you've got these malignant personalities in a subgroup, and you've got this comes from a tribal heritage, which gives them a kind of vague bond, kind of common thread, so we speak, mutual loyalty. There's possibly they get a knee-jerk support from their community for whatever they've done, and they might have a chip on their shoulder about the host culture, and a culture that allows them to have sex with young girls, and you've got a perfect recipe for a grooming gang. I think that's why these gangs have such an association with Muslims, particularly Pakistani Muslims. So of course, there are other personality types that might come out as well. I mean, there is the conservative personality type, where you've got a guy who's very traditionally dressed and maybe quite devout, actually, quite a good Muslim of the charity and fasting persuasion of Islam, rather than the jihadi one. But these guys don't tend to integrate very well at all, even if they are generally kind of harmless to people around them. And they might be a bit quietly territorial as well, trying to build a kind of cocoon for themselves where they can feel safe being conservative. They might overlap with another kind of guy who's very status conscious. And again, there's every society has these people who are very concerned about their status, but with a tribal background, this can lead to disastrous things like honor killings. Now, those guys I described do not overlap with the kind of guys who are in grooming gangs. Just use your eyes here. These guys aren't traditionally dressed. They don't give a fuck about Islam. They care about themselves. They don't care if they bring other Muslims into disrepute. Yes, they will cling to their Muslim heritage for support or try and use the race card, etc., if they can. But it's pure manipulation. They're just bad people. Of course, there is the other kind who could be the kind of confrontational type. Again, who might be quite territorial. And they might see themselves as really as in conflict with the host nation, and they can be a bit problematic. In most cases, they'll just be slightly bolshy young guys who'll grow out of it. But it's a thing, and they might overlap somewhat with the kind of grooming gang types as well. But their major issue would be they would seem to be kind of trying to create Muslim enclaves in the UK. I just want to reiterate that none of these personality types are in any way specific to Muslim or tribal or any other kind of particularly ethnic group of people. They're universal in all groups of people. But in non-tribal groups of people, we don't seem to see the same effect from them. They don't seem to stand out as much. But beyond the effects of these kind of tribal behaviours within groups within the UK, to make matters worse, there seems to be a perception that authorities aren't actually willing to engage with this issue. And this has been borne out by various investigations. For instance, the investigation into grooming gangs has quite clearly demonstrated that authorities just seem to want to ignore these issues. And the people perceive that authorities are more obsessed with protecting Muslim communities than they are in prosecuting crimes that may have come out of those communities. Why is this? Well, the usual explanation is fear of accusations of racism, which I have no reason to doubt that this is the case. It just seems to be perceived by lots of people that accusations of racism are the root cause for these behaviours by authorities. But if that is true, that is a direct consequence of poor leadership. If an official is doing their job and they're demonstrably doing it in a correct manner, they should be able to count on the support and protection of their senior management. That does not seem to be the case anymore in a lot of public authorities. Faith in senior management seems to be extremely low these days. But I believe actually there's another factor at play here, and which could actually explain a lot of the behaviour of senior management, and that is that there's a kind of a woke conceit going around. There are certain groups who want to believe that they have seen further, that they are the Illuminati, and that it is their calling to be the thin red line between mobs of ignorant Britons and the poor helpless immigrants. It justifies their existence and their belief in themselves. In fact, this is complete crap. Research shows that Britain is one of the most accepting societies in the world. Research by King's College in London said that actually the British are after 24 countries they looked at, the British were the fourth in the most welcoming, behind only Egypt, Sweden and Norway. They were the most trusting of the people in their neighbourhood. So this idea that you have to protect immigrants from the British, it is just tripe. But for some people, it justifies their own self-image. There's one other thing, and I think this is something that's often overlooked and not really considered very well. There is one actual real reason, I think, for this problem, that's the reluctance of authorities. And that is, we've all got the 7% of dark triad people, every society. But every society also just has some quite bolshy people who are looking for somebody to pick on. And these people will, because of the profile of Muslims now, they'll often use Muslims as their target. Unfortunately, it is the obvious Muslims, the kind of devout, kind of quiet, fairly harmless Muslims who will be the obvious target. It's going to be this guy here who's going to be the target, even though he doesn't really deserve it. It's not going to be these guys here. They're not traditionally dressed. You'd think of them as kind of integrated, even. It's deceptive. So the people in authority then have a kind of different perception. They're much more aware of kind of low-level harassment of Muslim communities than they are of severe crime committed by Muslim communities. So the police and politicians, in their day-to-day lives, they're hearing about a lot of mistreatment of various Muslims, and they think it's their job to protect them, and to some extent it is. So they talk a lot about Islamophobia definitions, etc. But the problem with that is that when there are real issues from the Muslim community, there's an instinct to hide them because they think it might make matters worse. Now, this is probably well-meaning, but it's extremely misguided. So what you find then is you've got your Bobby, your government official, your social worker in the eye of the storm. So they're aware they could be accused of racism if they get anything wrong. They're aware of a Muslim community, many of whose members are being unreasonably abused. They have little faith in their management, little trust in them. And at the same time, something nobody ever really mentions, but the girls involved, particularly in grooming gang cases, were difficult. So you've got guys who are looking at, there might be a young guy with a mortgage to pay, and they're looking at a difficult prosecution which could have negative effects on people and could cost them a lot personally themselves. And you just set these guys up to fail. And you can see this is the case because just look around the country. This did not happen in one isolated place. It happened everywhere. And when it's happening everywhere, it tells you it's systemic. It's not just failure by a few individuals. Now, the police didn't ask to have woke management, and they didn't ask to have toothless children's services that can't control these girls or keep them safe. And they didn't ask for the media to jump at any chance to call somebody racist, but they've got to put up with it. So while we can clearly blame people in management and in the media and in politics, we shouldn't really blame the actual officials on the ground because they didn't have much chance, to be honest. So to summarize, obviously anti-immigration sentiment often talks about numbers, but there's definitely a strain of concern about the social consequences as well. And those concerns seem to be largely associated with Muslims. That in fact the root cause of these consequences is not, they are real, but the root cause is not Islam, it's the tribal roots of the communities. All groups of people have antisocial personalities, but tribal attitudes can amplify these antisocial behaviours. And this has provoked resentment in the local populations, there's no doubt about it. And authorities have made matters worse by just simplistically seeing this resentment as racism. So what should we do in response to this? This is when it comes to the final point. What the heck, I've talked about the problem. What do we actually do to fix it? Well, first, we need authorities to accept that there are issues around parallel cultures, particularly ones that come from tribal backgrounds. Now, this is not saying that any group of people are intrinsically problematic. It's just that observing that different societies develop in different rates. When the Romans were building colosseums and the walls of Rome and marching legions around the world, they got to Britain and they found that Britons living in wattle and daub huts. Rome was far more developed than Britain. This just happens around the world. Some cultures are more developed than others. Second is don't worry. Okay? Second and third generation immigrants integrate just fine overall. Okay, there's a few bullshit ones, but most of them don't want to go back to their tribal roots. They'd quite like to drink beer and get a girlfriend, quite frankly. Yeah, they might have problems with their parents. They might be living double lives to some extent. But for the tribal nature of people just disappears with generations. So the culture will dissipate of its own accord if we don't keep feeding it. So government policy needs to resist immigration that promotes parallel tribal heritage communities in the UK or anywhere else for that matter. Tribalism is undesirable. In other words, we need a sophisticated anti-tribal immigration policy, not an anti-Muslim one. So, for instance, what I would describe as a couple of red flags, just for instances, I'm sure there's more to it than this, would be things like immigration through cousin marriage should be resisted. Low-skilled immigration from tribal areas should be carefully examined. And immigration from tribal areas into similar communities in the UK should again be resisted. Now, when I say sophisticated, I mean be sophisticated. I've given you a couple of suggestions here, but we've got to be clever and broad-minded about things. Just because you come from Pakistan, if you come from Karachi, if you're an engineer in Karachi, doesn't mean you have a tribal mindset. If you're a well-educated person from a very tribal area, you might be trying to get your kids out of there before your daughter has to marry your cousin. Some people maybe from tribal areas may be fleeing tribalism. Right? So we have to be careful and analytical about how we do this, as long as we have the goal in mind of preventing the development of tribal communities in the UK. Thank you for listening.